Hello Warriors, this is Mars. Welcome back to another ESO PvP build video. This is going to be a short commentary talking about the racial changes, giving my opinions and suggestions on how to improve it. So let's begin. So I think some of what's being implemented is looking really good for PvP, and it gives people more options and variety to make diverse builds. But I think they could have given more benefits to bring some races in line with others to improve the overall balance of combat. The changes to races makes most shine while a few others fall to the wayside. Some will become really good at one thing while others will excel at just about everything. I think the racial passives are going to be one of the deciding factors when it comes to build diversity. This means some races will be significantly better than others just because of passives alone. Min-maxing will be easier and making different builds will be more interesting, but only with the select few races. Me being someone who likes to play as a Redguard, can't help but say something about this. As a disclaimer, I'm going to be giving my opinion on all the races and giving suggestions on how to make races different, but at the same time balanced enough to be usable in high-end PvP. I'm saying this knowing the champion point system is being completely overhauled and combat being changed. I'm fully aware. The numbers I'm going to describe will be completely arbitrary. It is solely the idea I wish to bring forward for theory and potential ability changes. If you disagree with what I suggest, that's totally fine. I'm not one to deter healthy criticism on the channel. I will begin by talking about how I feel about the update to Redguard. Redguard didn't really get any passive changes and is exclusively on a tier lower than everything else, with its only change being a 5% increase to stamina return on its Adrenaline Rush passive, and then being accessible by any type of damage dealt. Having the proc come off of any type of damage is good for fighting outnumbered, but the 5% increase isn't a valuable enough change to contend against any of the other racial changes, since most of them either got an increase to resistance, damage done, or movement speed. Redguard has been put into a position where it is almost exclusively a tanking race, which isn't terrible, but it hasn't evolved since the inception of the previous racial changes. It can sustain almost infinitely now as long as damage or time abilities are maintained, and is not reliant on consistent melee attacks to activate the passive ability. But I think some of the other passives could have been changed to bring it forward and bring it in line with the B and A tier races. For example, martial training could have been changed so it not only gives a cost reduction to weapon skills, but also gives a form of resistance or increase to damage. The reduction to snare effects is not effective enough, or at all for that matter, to be a benefit, since snares can instantly be reapplied, and the fact that there are abilities to remove snares and grant immunity to snares and immobilizations, making that part of the passive worthless in my opinion. If you wanted to make this ability more effective and unique, I would suggest having it so that when you are snared or immobilized or hit with a disabling effect, it increases your physical resistances or reduces damage taken by a percentage for X amount of seconds, or as long as the negative effect persists. That way the effect puts Redguard in a position to have a stronger defensive posture. Or, instead of having a defensive stat, have a more offensive stat that falls in line with future potential changes that can be adjusted with the numerical value. An example I've come up with is a stacking effect similar to the classic set skills like Ravager and Warrior's Fury. Every direct damage melee attack you deal grants you a stack of martial knowledge. It stacks up to 5 times, granting 160 weapon and spell damage, as well as 1000 physical and spell penetration for 5 seconds, as well as retaining the reduced cost of weapon skills by 8%. That way they get something that's lore accurate and brings them in line with everything else. This way they aren't initially better than every other race, but it brings them in line to have something to differentiate themselves and offers more utility. Next, I feel Imperial should have gotten the increase to cost reduction but retain the resource gain from damage dealing effects. The cost reduction was a great change 100%, but to take away from the passive like that won't equate to higher sustainability or survivability than the previous patches. I feel that this is hit or miss. Nord, I think, was only changed to bring it in line with other races, which is somewhat acceptable. The 1300 resistance that was taken away isn't really going to hurt them at all, or as much as I believe it will. I think they're still going to be a very strong contender next patch, and they're really one of the best races in the game. Nor will practically be as strong as what it was before. To be honest, I think that amount was a little bit much. They shouldn't have taken so much away. I think it should have been brought down to 3,000 instead of 2,600. Bosmer, I think the changes done to Bosmer are also acceptable, but they should have not lost so much penetration. I think if you're going to give other races a flat value of damage, it should be able to contend with that. I understand it's now a consistent stat, but it was only valuable to run a Bosmer as a Stam blade in PvP since they benefited the most from a roll dodge playstyle. Other than that, I think Bosmer is positioned well enough for the next patch. The speed reduction was an acceptable change. They have solid sustain and they have solid resistances. The fact that they have resistance to poison and disease makes them a strong contender against certain dot builds and proc sets. So Dunmer, I think the changes were pretty light, which is acceptable. Dunmer is a pretty stout hybrid race and is built well enough to play Mag and Stam exclusively. I'm not sure how I feel about them no longer being immune to the fire status effect, but that will have to be up for debate. All in all, Dunmer is looking really good. So High Elves are now a hybrid race, which is what was intended by the dev team since they got the Searbane passive a few patches ago. I think High Elves are going to be a new contender in the meta because of the added weapon damage. I think it's a pretty good change since the lore quotes them as being talented warriors as well as mages. I'm actually tempted to turn my Nord Stam Sword back into a High Elf. My only question is, will they eventually get stamina? As much as I would think they wouldn't because they have the Searbane passive, the future to racial changes is always uncertain. So next is Argonian. I think the 875 reduction to the Resourceful passive was an acceptable change on Argonian. I don't think that's going to affect them that much at all but the removal of their disease and poison immunity will. That, in my opinion, was one of their best selling points because you couldn't defile them unless you used a set or a skill that was coded in the game to defile. The additional stamina makes them much more attractive to both Magicka and Stamina classes. All in all, I think Argonian is still one of the best and most formidable races on Tamriel. So Breton only received a 30-point increase to Magicka Sustain, which is completely acceptable since they gained spell resistance from the same passive, almost equal to the total resistance of that of other races and the total armor value that Nords have, which pretty much brings them in line to be a good defensive race, and that's completely acceptable. They didn't need much of a change. They were practically perfect. Khajiit basically got an increase to their maximum stat, critical damage done, and healing done. Khajiit was brought up quite nicely. It's a light adjustment, but with integration of new sets and champion point changes, I think they have benefited exceptionally. So last but not least is the Orsimer. Orca got so much this patch it's not even funny. The decline of their max stam doesn't even affect their outgoing damage on top of getting spell damage, so they're completely hybridized now. I think Orc is going to be even scarier than it was on classes that can be built to be tanky and increase their overall healing done with major and minor buffs. All they have to do now is build for defense. They literally have everything else. You may not see them getting spell damage as a big deal, but in reality it is. The spell damage on a Stam DK and a Magplar will break the healing mechanic for the game. Paired with a new Unflinching Rage passive, Orc is going to be very hard to contend against. Now, I've said all of this. I'm not arguing or demanding that ZOS makes any changes. I'm aware that the patch is subject to change and that this is still in the PTS and potentially anything could happen. I 100% support the buffs and changes that all the races got, but I simply just wanted to state my opinions and talk about potential changes that could be made in the future. I don't know the direction of the future changes to races, but I think they're going in the right direction. I simply wanted to add my own input. So that's pretty much it, guys. That's how I felt about like the racial changes when I first saw them. I kind of didn't want to let myself get too excited about the changes, especially for Redguard, just because I knew from seeing the passive changes the other races got. I was like, yeah, Redguard ain't getting shit. But I think the changes with the direct damage is pretty cool. Any type of damage can now proc that. Like I said before, Redguard's probably going to have a really high level of sustain, and that's going to be really cool. I like it because 1vx is going to be a bit easier. I mean, I'm not a 1vx guy, I'm just a PvP guy. But yeah, it's just, I wanted to be involved in the change. Make my little mark, just have that out there. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you enjoyed the commentary. Thanks again for watching, and have a great day.